Welcome to the Euro Express with me, your host, Kevin Turley. On this show, we climb aboard the Euro Express to visit different European locations where we talk to people living there about their lives and their faith. It's as if we're hurtling through Europe in the dining compartment of the Orient Express with good food and even better conversation. So, all aboard the Euro Express. Hello. Today on the Euro Express we head to Brussels where we collect Marguerite Peeters, an expert in global governance. And then we head to Rome where climbing on board is the National Catholic Register's Rome correspondent, Edward Pentin. Edward, Marguerite, welcome on board the Euro Express.
Glad to be
with you.
Marguerite, if I can start with you, an expert on global governance. At this time we're living in, one of global crises, the world doesn't seem to really have much global governance. What would you say to somebody who says, actually, at a time of crisis, it seems that each national government decides to move into a position of isolationism rather than some sort of idea of world fraternity?
Mm-hmm. Yes, the global governance that I have been studying is of quite a different nature. It is not the ideal of fraternity in the Christian sense. We have to go back to the end of the Cold War. And you know that in 1989, the West somehow complacently proclaimed the end of ideology and the triumph of its model. And at that time, the United Nations wanted, building on this proclamation of the West, the triumph of the Western model, took on the initiative to build a new global consensus on a set of norms that were adopted at UN conferences in the 1990s. And these norms really incorporate the objectives of the Western cultural, feminist, sexual revolution.
So Marguerite, would it be fair to say that since the 1990s, organizations such as United Nations have been promoting an ideology and agenda which is counter, really, to the gospel, to the teachings of the Church?
Yes, I think that, after the downfall of Marxism-Leninism, some people were ready with an agenda, and they were in the positions of power at the end of the Cold War in the institutions of the United Nations, but not only the United Nations. A lot of these NGOs like Planned Parenthood that had been partnering with the United Nations during the whole Cold War, and they came up with a proposal that the governments, member states of the United Nations endorsed by way of consensus during these conferences. Yes.
Edward, you are at the centre of the Catholic Church there in Rome. Obviously, you report on the Vatican daily for the National Catholic Register. Have you experienced in your career there that sort of trend, that sort of UN agenda? And if so, what has been the Church's, the Vatican's reaction to that?
Yes, very much so. It's been increasingly the case here that the Holy See has got closer to the United Nations, but at the same time, instead of getting closer for what it wishes to achieve, which is to increase its essential networks and to improve basically its dialogue with the UN, but keeping firm in the faith and keeping the teaching basically at the center of its presence at the UN, it's gradually sort of become absorbed into the UN system, including the UN sort of ideology. And that, I think, has been extremely, or rather has become much clearer during this pontificate. It was very much the case already in the pontificates before, but not so clear. And in some ways, the Church was very effective in pushing back some of the UN's agenda, for example, on abortion rights and international abortion right. That was back in the 90s. But under this pontificate, it's become very much part of the UN machine. And I think there's been a growing concern about that. But also, I think people see it as quite helpful. They see that they can see what's going on here, that the UN is basically trying to co-opt the Holy See in order to give its programs moral weight. But the church isn't getting much back in return. And in fact, the criticism is that it's really selling out to the UN. And as what Stefano Fontana, who's the head of the Fantuan Observatory in northern Italy here, he says, he's a professor, Fontana, he says that the language and philosophy behind the UN and the adoption of this language and philosophy is basically a flattening of ideas that removes the metaphysical structure and doctrinal absoluteness of the church. So it's a very much, as some see, a very much a sort of insidious effect that the UN is having on the Holy See, and not just the UN, but sort of international globalist institutions as a whole.
Marguerite, do you recognize some of what Edward's saying, that the church has been co-opted for an agenda which may not be in keeping with its teachings?
There is a great danger of that, yes, because there's a very fine line that separates the social doctrine of the church from UN agendas. You know, the UN has been forging an entirely new language, a language that is not contained in the UN Charter nor in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. You know, sustainable development, sexual and reproductive health, the gender perspective, the partnership principle, and so on. And this language, if you study the origin, you know, the people who forged this language, they really had an ideological agenda. And part of this agenda was, of course, you know, population control and the sexual revolution and the radical feminist agenda. And it has been integrated in these concepts since the very beginning, since the seminal stage. If you trace back the history of sustainability, for example, you find that, you know, population control was at the very birth of that concept, and it has been carried forward through the people who have pushed it forward at the UN and who were ideologues.
So would you say, Marguerite, that, I mean, the United Nations was formed in the debris of the Second World War. It was to create a better world, a world of cooperation. Would you say that from the earliest days, from the 1940s, late 40s onwards, then, that this agenda has been there in the background and is then more in the foreground now? Or has it always been something, has there always been ideologies at work within the United Nations which are essentially un-Christian?
Mm-hmm. Well, I see that since the beginning, since the foundation of the United Nations, there were seeds that were sown already in the UN Charter. You saw the influence of some people. If you think on the US delegation, there was a lady called Virginia Gildersleeve. She was part of the US delegation to the San Francisco conference that adopted the Charter. And some of these, you know, ideological women were behind the introduction of women's rights in the Charter. So, of course, we are for women's rights, but it's all a matter of interpretation now.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
So, did the end of the Cold War then create a sort of vacuum, or was there an ascendancy then of these ideas? I mean, was there a quickening in terms of their promulgation within the UN and across the world, would you say?
I would say that, you know, the Western world left a vacuum that these people who came from a neo-Marxist background were ready and happy to fill. No sooner did the Berlin Wall fall, it started immediately in 1990. You already had two, you know, global UN conferences. They didn't waste a minute. They immediately filled the vacuum because they had been partnering with the United Nations during the Cold War, and unfortunately the West, and this is, you know, what I mean by the globalization of the Western Cultural Revolution, the West at that time was weakened by decades of cultural revolution. So, you know, the ideas of liberty, equality, human rights, human dignity had all become very ambivalent and could be interpreted, according to, the law that God has written in our hearts, or according to the agenda of the sexual revolution.
Edward, you've written about, and I know you've studied Africa and the whole impact of globalization on Africa. I'm just thinking that is the UN, in terms of its dealings with Africa, exporting really an alien ideology into a continent, for just as an example, which has very different values, and maybe values which are closer to the gospel still than we have in Western Europe?
Yes, I mean, this has been a process that's been going on for a while now, of course, and many people have written about this ideological colonization that's taking place in Africa and other parts of the global south, which have traditional ways of living which are very much in tune with what the church teaches in many ways, of course, those that have been evangelized, the importance of the family and the abhorrence of abortion and all of these things, the rejection of contraception and these different aspects. So there's that's been going on for a long time, and the UN, of course, is significant in that. But it's not just the UN; it's national governments in Europe and the West which have been exporting this colonization and linking it with aid and saying, well, if you accept our aid, then you must change your policies on the LGBT agenda and all of this sort of thing. And so this has been going on, but I think the mistake, perhaps, well, I don't know, but this is what I can see, is that the Holy See seems to be not naive, but perhaps overlooking the fact that this agenda, this ideological colonization, is in fact like a sort of religion. It's a dogma in itself, and it doesn't seem to. It seems to think that one can sort of dialogue with that sort of ideology and not be sort of taken along with it wholesale. And I think there is and as Professor Fontana says, I mean, there is a huge danger here that the church is going along with the whole agenda, saying that it's not part of this, for example, the Sustainable Development Goals, which includes reproductive health, which is basically abortion. They say, well, we don't accept that, but we accept the rest of the goals. But I think there's a growing concern here that this is not possible. You can't really go along with that without going along with it wholesale. And I think the UN is, I don't know whether it's intentionally doing it, but it seems to be wishing that the Holy See will eventually sort of come round to its position. And so it's quite happy to wait the long game and hope that the church will gradually weaken its teaching on these areas, and then you eventually get a sort of one world religion with the UN at the center. And that seems to be what's the direction that seems to be going, at least from the experts that I've talked to in this area. And as I said earlier, I mean, I think Africa is a good example of this, and the effect that this has had on Africa, or is threatening to affect Africa. And certainly lots of people are very concerned about that. There's Obianuju Ekioka who runs the Culture of Life in Africa Institute, and she's written a good book on this called Target Africa. There's other people too who are very concerned about this, and it really is undermining. It seems to be undermining the basic fabric of the societies there.
Marguerite, would you say that Africa is a very good example as a continent that's had this sort of neo-colonialism exported to it, these foreign ideologies? Would that be your understanding of that?
Oh yes, of course, yes. But Africa has been also the most resilient continent of all the continents, and that's why there has been such a persevering attacks against Africa. And Edward was mentioning that it has been a long process, but I think there has been an acceleration of this process since the 1990s, definitely, because what these UN conferences of the 1990s did was to obtain, a so-called global consensus on sexual and reproductive health, which contains, safe abortion and universal access to the whole range of contraceptive methods and sexuality education and all the bad things that we. And since since the Cairo conference, there has been an acceleration, and what is very, very, very sad to see is that these policies in the long run are effective. The fertility rate is dropping in Africa, and they are very much targeting Africa because the demographic growth is the greatest in Africa. They have, they contend that by the end of this century, 40% of the world population will be African, and right now it's around a little below 20%.
Yes.
And this is taking into account a drop in the fertility rate, from over 4.5% to 2.1, which is the replacement rate.
Do you, in your researches and in your discussions with people, do you find that there's much of a pushback from Africa on this, Marguerite? Do you find that African nations are organised, or do they see the threat? Do they perceive that there's a kind of neo-colonialisation taking place in their midst?
Well, yes, they perceive it. There is a great deal of ignorance. I've been going to Africa and speaking to Episcopal conferences, and I was so, edified by the reaction of African pastors who really wanted to do something about it. But their weakness is, organization, to be organized, and you need, to be organized to resist this tidal wave. Yeah. But I wanted to come back on something that, Edward was saying about the danger of the church being co-opted in this partnership with the UN. Because I have been studying, the dynamics of partnerships. Let me explain. These agendas come from individuals who have started NGOs, and then after the end of the Cold War, these non-state partners, these non-state actors, managed to obtain an intergovernmental consensus on their agenda. And so they have and when you read the documents of UN conferences in the 1990s, you realize that governments really agree to share their sovereignty more and more with an increasingly wide array of non-state actors, and at the Istanbul conference in '96, they have adopted the partnership principle, which means that these agendas cannot be implemented by governments alone, and therefore governments have to partner with NGOs, with the business enterprise, with the universities, the academic world, with trade unions. And all of these different actors internalize and share the same agenda, which comes from above, the global agenda. And actually, if you study this, you can really recognize that this has been implemented. If you look at the curriculum of universities, you will see that they have adopted, sustainable development studies, gender studies, and all these agendas that come from this global level. And this partnership system has been extending from NGOs, individuals, to NGOs, to governments, to businesses. And then in 2004, there was a conference in Amsterdam, and the pro-abortion, pro-reproductive health people decided to change their strategy vis-à-vis cultures and religions. And they said, from foes to partners. Because in Cairo, in '94, the Catholic Church and the Muslims were opposed, enemies of the UN agenda, and they said we need to change our strategy and we need to partner now with religions, and the greatest enemy of all is, of course, the Catholic Church, because of its clear teaching on all these issues.
Yes.
And so there has been an ongoing effort to try and co-opt the church more and more.
Edward, listening to Marguerite and also your own, what you were saying just a while ago, are we having a sort of rerun of the Cold War, where we had an ideology, an international bloc, which was then known as the Eastern Bloc, exporting its ideology worldwide? And in many countries, it saw the Catholic Church, both within that empire and externally, as one of its primary enemies. I mean, are we seeing a sort of rerun of history, but just with a different ideological partner or proponent on the opposite side, trying to force the church to compromise?
I think that does seem to be the case. Yes, I would agree. But I remember writing about this a long time ago for my master's degree, about how it was a rather idealistic dissertation that I wrote about how you could sort of partner between the church, NGOs, and government. And I sort of thought that, having had my experience in Africa, that this would be a great way of preserving African culture. I mean, you can't just say Africa, but the individuals' cultures within Africa, and that way would preserve them, but also preserve also the faith and the sense of transcendence, which has been lost very much in the West. And but one can see now that was obviously quite a utopian vision of when I was much younger. And now you can see that, in fact, the church isn't perhaps strong enough to withstand, at least in its current state, this great sort of force of, as I said earlier, this kind of dogma that's coming across from globalism, from this sort of ideology. And in a sense, it does seem as though that there is this, as you say, this kind of Cold War between what's always been the sort of the tenets of Western civilization, and now you've got this whole new agenda, which is quite at odds and very much more, as some would say, akin to sort of a Marxist, socially Marxist vision, which is obviously not compatible with the churches. So again, yeah, I just think there's this. There does seem to be this weakness of the church now. At least that's the observation, the common observation being made now, that it's not able to withstand this sort of dogma, which is becoming pervasive in not only in the West now, but in other parts of the world as well.
I just wonder, though, from a historical perspective, Edward, and you're in Rome, where there is a great sense of history often. I mean, is this a battle essentially that's been there since the French Revolution, that you've had various atheistic or alien ideologies that have been confronting the church in different ways, and this latest one is just sort of, as I say, the Cold War ended and the communism, for the moment anyway, the threat of it receded, and then we have this different ideology which is equally anti-Christian, which is looking to infiltrate the church. But I use the historical perspective because each of these ideologies in the last 300 years have all had their day and have disappeared, and the church remains. I mean, do you see a glimmer of hope in the eternal city that the gates of hell shall not prevail?
Well, yes. I mean, of course, we believe that, and eventually that all will be well. But I think at the moment, my knowledge of history, I'm no expert in history, but from what I've experienced here and what I know from my own writings, that this is the first time that you've really had the church not give a sort of robust resistance to this kind of thing, and it seems to be going along with it. Whereas in the other ideologies, it was quite strong, of course, against communism and against previous ideologies which were against the church. But this, because it seems to be more subtle, is having a more insidious effect, I would say, on the church. But that's just from my observations here, from what I see. And I mean, yes, that's probably not what the Vatican would say, and I'm pretty sure that is not what they would say, because they see this really as a chance to give the church's voice in this whole environment. This is why, for example, Cardinal Pietro Parolin, the Vatican Secretary of State, went to give a talk at the Bilderberg group. I mean, that famous group, which is often considered to be very a dark group which is up to this globalist pushing this globalist agenda. Now a lot of people wondered, well, why would he go there? And he said, I mean, I asked him why he went, and he said, well, it's the only chance that they'll hear the gospel, and that's why I went, and that's why the UN is represented at these different organizations, so that they hear the gospel and hear what the church teaches. But I think the jury's out about whether they really are doing that, or whether they're kind of accepting and going along with their agenda.
Marguerite, ultimately, what is this agenda's end game within the UN, maybe within the European Union and other national states? I mean, it's something which is happening globally, but it is something which has been happening in many national countries for many years, this kind of pushing of various agendas, which are in the ascendant by and large. I mean, what is the ultimate end game? That the church will simply compromise with the world?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that we have to have a theological sense of history. There's a beginning of history, and then we're heading towards the end of times. Yeah, I'm not saying that we are in the end of times, but I adhere to the theology of history of Hans Urs von Balthasar, who said that, the more we advance in history, and the greater the struggle between good and evil will be, the spiritual combat will be.
Right.
And I do believe that we are seeing that. It's not only in some countries of the world today, it's in all countries of the world. We can really say, because I have, studied this, that these global norms forged by people who were, spearheads in the cultural revolution of the West have really been globalized, because I've had Chinese students, I've had students from Asia, from Africa, and when I talk about these phenomena, they recognize it immediately as happening in their own country. It's a global agenda which is not only nationally implemented, but locally implemented, because there are now partnership systems that make these agendas go down all the way to, the local school, the local healthcare center,
yeah,
all the way down. And
absolutely, and we see this in different national territories where the laws are enacted which are counter to Catholic teaching very clearly, counter to Christianity very clearly, but not just counter to it, but often limiting or preventing any kind of discussion, so that the Catholic perspective cannot be advanced even. I mean, Edward, do you think we're sort of potentially moving to a sort of new catacombs where I mean, if the UN and these ideologies are so ascendant across the world, ultimately it will not be so much an infiltration or a co-opting of the church, but a sort of silencing of the church and a pushing Catholicism, Christianity to the margins of society, if at all allowed to remain there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that could be the way we're going. It's hard to say, but all I can say is from what one can see here, the different initiatives that are coming from the Vatican here in collaboration with the UN and this sort of globalist agenda, it's not putting up any real resistance. I mean, you've got we've had this month, we had the Global Education Pact that Pope Francis introduced. He relaunched it. That's been backed, of course, by very much sort of UNESCO, for example, and other rather globalist groups. Next month, we've got the Economy of Francesco, which is basically being put together by people like Jeffrey Sachs, the economist, who's very much the heart of the globalist agenda, somebody who's against, who's pro-population control, has spoken very much about this. He's been in collaboration with the Vatican actually before Francis. He was actually coming to conferences here under Benedict XVI. So as I said earlier, this is something that's been going on for a while now. But again, it's to do with this. I think this idea that very much came from the Second Vatican Council, which is that the church has to dialogue and encounter and look at the positive aspects of other other groups and ideologies and religions. But there's a flip side to that, I think, which one's seeing, which is that it's taking on the things that it shouldn't perhaps be taking on, and that it's being sort of hoodwinked, as I said earlier. But I think, anyway, as I say, I think you can see these things happening, and they're speeding up, and you're seeing more and more of these initiatives coming, these collaborative initiatives coming with these sort of globalists and those who are pushing this agenda.
I mean, what would you suggest is given Catholic teaching or the social doctrine of the Church? I mean, it's all about local, isn't it? It's all about getting everything down to local levels, where individual cultures, individual territories, jurisdictions can decide their own fate, can decide their way of living. This globalist agenda seems to be going in the opposite direction. It seems to be turning everything into a sort of top-down, sort of heavy. Is that your understanding of it in essence, Edward?
It does seem to be. And what's interesting, I mean, I remember about maybe 10, 15 years ago, there was this global sort of fad that sort of took off, where you were in part of the globalized world, but it was also a local thing. That local element seems to have dropped off completely, and now it's all about globalism, and it's all about, as you say, this sort of top-down approach, which I think is quite an interesting development. And now the local aspect seems to have been forgotten. But that whole important tradition that the Church has of subsidiarity is no longer, unfortunately, considered to be that important, and the Church doesn't seem to talk about it, or the Vatican doesn't talk about it so much now either. So I think, yeah, there's an interesting development there, certainly, that it's become more of this sort of one world vision than it was before.
Marguerite, in Brussels, you'll be very familiar with events in Europe in the last few years where there's been very much dissension about the European project, as it's called, the European Union. Obviously Brexit, where the UK decided to opt out and is still in the process of opting out of that. But we've also seen in Eastern Europe, in countries like Hungary and Poland, a desire to create their own identity or retain their own Catholic identity, much in the face of whatever that global agenda is coming from, whether it's from Europe or from the UN or wherever. Do you see signs of hope in that?
I certainly see signs of hope in any kind of will to assert your sovereignty and to resist this globalism. I find the absence of resistance, the absence of independent thinking is absolutely amazing. People are just following without reflecting and without knowing the history of all the concepts that they are endorsing, or knowing even the meaning of the words that they're using. You know. But if you allow me, I would like to come back on, what Edward was saying about dialogue, the Church and dialogue, because the first encyclical that Paul VI wrote was about dialogue, but Paul VI established very clearly the conditions for this dialogue to take place, and he said that for the Church to dialogue, before entering into dialogue, the Church had to renew a sense, a consciousness of her identity. The Church had to know what her only mission is, which is a mission of bringing salvation. It's a salvific mission, and the Church has only one mission. It doesn't have a diplomatic mission and a salvific mission. Everything the Church does has to be at the service of this salvific mission. So we shouldn't be totally against dialogue, but dialogue, knowing who you are and
yes,
knowing
exactly
what your mission is.
Absolutely. I'm sure you'd agree with that, Edward.
Yes, well, it was like what I was saying earlier, that I think if the Church were stronger in her identity and teaching, perhaps, and over the past 60 years that it's been weakened, that maybe it would be more in a position to dialogue. But I think from what I can see here is that it's not so convinced, or it's not so strong in her identity, and that that is making this dialogue much more difficult and much more compromising, I think, for the church.
Would you say? I mean, the church doesn't come out of a vacuum, though. It comes out of essentially the Western Europe, I guess, in terms of its thinking. And Western Europe, in the last 60 years, has gone through this major revolution in terms of its ethics, in terms of its morals, in terms of how society is shaped. And there's an element whereby the church is within that revolution, or that silent revolution that's been taking place, and it's no doubt been affected by it. I mean, we see that in some of the pronouncements locally, or the way Catholics don't quite understand how church teaching works or reject certain parts of it. How does the church not just counter globalism, but actually evangelize the world in a way that these issues are dealt with within the prism of faith, as opposed to being seen perhaps as maybe quasi-political issues?
Well, if I may, I think maybe I'm being a bit controversial here, but I think a big problem is that the church seems to have forgotten a lot of the teaching that came sort of before the council, and it very rarely sort of reflects on tradition and the fact that it's got a teaching. The magisterium goes back 2,000 years. It didn't begin in 1965, and I think there is a danger that all the documents that have come over the past 60 years don't really reflect on the fact that the church has this great, rich history, and that's all part of the church's identity, and that is why I think it has been weakened, and that's why dialogue is difficult now for the church, because it's and difficult in terms of preserving what the church has always taught, because it doesn't seem to reflect enough, at least this is what I hear and what I can see myself, on the sort of the tradition, the wealth of the tradition of the church and her teaching.
Marguerite, how would you advise the church to interact or react to this globalist agenda?
Well, I think, the problem, what I observe is that the church has, to a large extent, entered the framework that was set and established by others. Yeah? The church, in my view, should step out of that framework and, speak from, witness to the gospel, but from outside of this framework, this conceptual framework, and speaking of the relationship between the Church and the United Nations, the Church is an observer at the UN, but does not always behave as an observer, in the sense that it does enter this framework using the same concepts that the UN has established, and sometimes perhaps out of ignorance of the history of these concepts and the consequences where these concepts lead to. So the first thing would be to step out of that framework.
Is it a case, Marguerite, of stepping out, or is it a case of devising as another framework, trying to create a framework which is essentially Christian, and which to invite others to enter into?
Well, I wouldn't call the church or the gospel a framework. I wouldn't call it that way, because the gospel is liberating. It's the truth that liberates us, and it's for everybody. We're not framed by the gospel, I think. Yeah.
If I may, what I found interesting, and I put this once to Archbishop Tomasi, who was then the Holy See's representative to the UN in Geneva, and I asked him why in all of the messages that the Holy See gives at the UN, there's almost no reference to Christ and to, actually explicitly referencing Christ. Even when they're talking about peace, they're not willing to talk about the Prince of Peace. And I wondered why, that is. And I think his answer was basically, well, we have to, as you were saying, Marguerite, be part of this framework essentially, and we can't sort of go out of that framework by talking about, explicitly about the gospel. And that to me was quite revealing, and I think sort of underlines what you're saying and what we've been saying as well, that there's been the weakening of the church's identity because it's sort of compromising with the UN mechanism and with the framework, as you say. So I think that's sort of as a good example of that, I think.
But would it be the case that if the church proclaimed Christ in season and out of season to the UN, day in, day out, I mean, would it be a case, though, that the UN might turn around and say, well, actually, we're not interested, and the church would lose any sort of bargaining place at that table?
Yeah, I mean, that's their argument. That is very much the Holy See's argument, that there has to be this sort of compromise. But there's a price, I think, to be paid for that compromise, and perhaps that's what we're seeing now, and that's why we're seeing all of this this sort of surrendering almost to this globalist agenda. And but yeah, that certainly is the argument, and they will say, well, it's better to have a seat at the table than not, and you're not going to get a seat at the table if you're explicitly preaching the gospel in season and out of season. So yes, I think that's true, Kevin. Yeah.
Marguerite, do you think there'll ever come a point when the UN will no longer need the church? I mean, that if its agenda gets to a point where it can turn around to the Holy See and say, well, actually, we're not interested in what you think. We have so much of the world on our side. We have so much pitted against you. I mean, the Holy See is seems to me to be a very small entity in a great sea of other countries which have signed up for this agenda. Is there ever a point where the UN will just dispense with the Holy See in the sense that it's just not interested?
Well, I think it's useful for them to have, the Pope back, for example, the climate change agenda, because they know that the Pope is an authority and is listened to in the all over the world, especially in developing countries. So I'm not sure they would want to do away, because it's not only the Holy See. It's behind the Holy See you have the entire Universal Church.
Yes. Right.
That represents a lot of people. Yeah.
Do you see any signs of hope within the United Nations, Marguerite? Do you see any signs of alliances that could be devised, as we were talking earlier about Cairo and the Muslim world, or even Africa, or people of goodwill generally who can start to debate maybe more robustly with the Holy See on these topics, on this agenda?
Well, there are signs of hope. Just recently there was this Geneva Consensus Declaration, which is far from perfect, but it's I think 32 countries that have signed a declaration, against abortion. It's not enough to be against abortion, because that very same text remains within the framework. It mentions the Sustainable Development Goals and sexual and reproductive health. So, there are certain agendas of the UN, like abortion, that rally a lot of people, countries, delegations in New York against these agendas. But I think the solution would be for, powerful governments to realize that they need to step out of the framework. Because yes, what I have historically studied is how all these ideological agendas have been woven into the fabric of the sustainable development, which is the umbrella concept. And you really cannot separate one agenda from another. They are all interwoven. So the solution to that is to step out, not use that new global language. And when Edward was saying that we should perhaps preach Christ at the UN, I think what needs to be the witness that is expected from the Church as the UN is to speak out, to speak the social doctrine of the Church, because on all the issues that the UN is addressing, the environment, women's issues, population issues, the Church has an answer that comes from the Gospel in its social doctrine, and this is what should be expressed in the language that comes from divine revelation, not necessarily preaching Christ, but indirectly through the social doctrine of the Church.
So, in your opinion, Marguerite, why isn't this being proclaimed? Why isn't the social doctrine of the Church being spoken of in Geneva or New York at the UN headquarters?
Well, we cannot say that it's not proclaimed. I think they're probably making an effort, but I think that the mistake which is being made is that they think they are bound by the language and the concepts of the UN, and I would just step out of that and use my own the language of the Church and express the view of the Church on all these issues, because the line, if you read, it's true, the Gaudium et Spes, all the topics that Gaudium et Spes addresses, the human rights and the family and all these issues have become the issues that global governance addresses. And so they run the message of the Church and that of global governance run in parallel, or sometimes they seem to merge dangerously.
Edward, do you see any signs of hope from Rome about this? Do you see any possible sort of changes in direction or a more robust way in which the Church may engage with the United Nations outside of the paradigm?
No real signs yet. I think with this pontificate, it's very much on board with a lot of what the UN is doing, and just to show again the involvement of the UN. Jeffrey Sachs, who I was saying earlier, I mean, he was one of the main drafters of the Sustainable Development Goals, and he's very much involved with the Vatican, contributing to encyclicals. I think he probably had a hand in Fratelli Tutti, Pope Francis's latest encyclical. So they're very much sort of hand in hand. So I don't see that. I don't see that really changing. But if I could ask you, Marguerite, just one question about. I noticed you wrote about the sexual revolution and how this has a lot to do with that. A lot of the problems to do with this ideology goes back to that. And I wondered if you think that revolution is perhaps coming to an end, and that perhaps that's where there's some hope that this revolution is basically dying out. And that I think somebody said that revolutions only last 70 years, or the effects of them. And so perhaps we're coming to the end of that now. Do you agree with that?
To some extent, yes, because I think that now even the United Nations has to confront the consequences, the negative consequences of the sexual revolution. And UNESCO published 2 years ago, in 2018, guidelines for sexuality education, and it's completely different in tone from the May 68 optimism, sexual liberation and so on. Here it's extremely negative, because you're only dealing with violence, sexually transmitted diseases, harassment, and so on. But the document, it's not because we are coming to the end of a revolution that we are out of the tunnel, because the end of this sexual revolution is leading to something that could perhaps even be worse. And what I see in this, manual is the attempt to really globalize a sexuality education, the purpose of which would be to turn all children into, good global citizens that not only tolerate the wide diversity of sexual lifestyles, but who accept it. There's a change of vocabulary from tolerance to acceptance and internalization. So this really, invites the child to commit his conscience to a very evil agenda. Because, so I do not see that in the documents of the United Nations, even if they realize they have to take into account the negative consequences of the sexual revolution, it doesn't mean that they are converting yet.
So it could be going into it could be going into a second phase in a sense, a second second chapter of this.
Yes, I think every revolution transforms itself. You could argue that the end of communism, has transformed itself into this globalist agenda. Gorbachev himself was, shifted from one to the other.
Of course, we're talking at a moment in history where things are very uncertain, and how things have been for the last 20, 30, 40, even 50 years. We may not experience that even in the few years ahead of us. We are in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic across the world. Whatever the health consequences for that, the economic consequences are looking pretty dire. And I mean, sexual revolution, the sexual revolution of the last 60 or 70 years has been piggybacked on an economic boom that the world has never seen before, where lifestyles have got better and better and better, and people have had time to deal with or had time to explore these issues, whereas we may be moving to a slightly bleaker future. And I just wonder, in light of what you're saying about the Cold War as well, ultimately what crashed the Soviet Empire was not so much tanks and guns and bombs as opposed to economics, that it just kind of burnt itself out. Probably dying under a weight of bureaucracy as well. And I just wonder if there's something in the sexual revolution, the cultural revolution that we have all been subject to for many years, which is inherently sort of rotten. That unlike the city of God, this city of man that's being created will ultimately sort of collapse in on itself, if only because the culture that it's creating is one of death, one of despair, one of unhappiness. And we see that all the time. We see that in the polarization in politics across the globe. We see that in people who are deeply, deeply unhappy. And I just wonder if the true gospel is one of hope and one of regeneration and one of inspiring something which is much more than what is on offer from this culture of death. And if within itself there's not a seed, that this thing is so poor and destructive of its own accord that it will kind of collapse. What do you think? Is that too optimistic?
No. I think that's quite right. And we all do feel in our hearts that we're living a very special moment now in history. And we know that God is leading history and that He's speaking to everybody's hearts. And I am sure that, what you're saying is quite true. I think we may be at this moment, but we do not see how we can get out of this situation by ourselves, and we do hope that a grace directly from God will come, like a new Pentecost. To God Himself will instruct everyone, because
absolutely. Yeah. So, Edward, do you think that the New Jerusalem will be built out of the ruins of the old Babylon? Within Europe and elsewhere?
Well, that's the hope, isn't it? I think we have to, as Catholics, have to hope that's going to happen at some point, and maybe things have to get worse before they get better. But I think at the centre here is the loss of faith, wouldn't you say? I think the loss of the turning away from God is what's led to a lot of this, and then until that changes, then it's just going to continue to get worse. And unfortunately, I think Benedict, or Joseph Ratzinger, when he was cardinal, I think he wrote that, when there is a turning away from God, then tyranny prevails, and I think we're seeing that at the moment. So hopefully this will be short-lived, though. Yeah.
So yes, Edward, I think you're right. I mean, sometimes in the darkest times, though, that's when people are brought to Christ. If one thinks of the apparition at Fatima coming in the midst of the horrors of the First World War, the message there was one which didn't spare us of the difficulties ahead, but ultimately had a very, very positive ending.
Yes, and I think often one hears this more and more, that Our Lady, the Immaculate Heart, will triumph, and that is what we must put our hope in, that actually this is a phase we have to go through, but the Lord wins in the end, and has won, in fact. So we have to take comfort in that.
Absolutely. And Marguerite, a lot of this agenda, a lot of these attacks are against the family. And we know who is the great patron of families, the great protector of families, indeed the protector of Holy Church, which is St. Joseph, who also appeared at Fatima. and blessed the world in a silent way with the child Jesus at that apparition. In the litany of St. Joseph, one of my favourite sayings is, St. Joseph, terror of demons, pray for us. And we are assailed on all sides, but as St. Paul says, not defeated. Would you say St. Joseph is a good man to go to in these dire circumstances?
I think it's fantastic.
So, on the note of the Immaculate Heart triumphing and St. Joseph protecting us, I think we're going to be okay, and the Euro Express can continue on its way in safety with those pilots. Edward Pentin in Rome, thank you very much. Marguerite Peeters in Brussels, thank you both very much for taking part in this Euro Express, and I hope to see you again sometime commuting on this line.
Thank you, Kevin.